Report 1. I have always loved the idea of outdoor adventure, but I have never been very experienced in survival. Last winter, I decided to hike in the snowy mountains of Colorado, something that had been on my list for years. I went alone, which I now see as a colossal mistake. The plan was simple: hike up, spend the night in a small cabin marked on the map, and return the next day. But snow can be treacherous, and that night I discovered that the solitude of the mountains can hide things that no one should find. I arrived at the starting point just after dawn. The air was frigid, and the ground was covered by a layer of snow. The trail was well marked at first, with signs along the way, and the sky was clear with the sun shining. Everything seemed perfect. I hiked for hours, admiring the untouched landscapes and the absolute silence. But as the afternoon wore on, the sky began to close in. Heavy clouds appeared, and snow started to fall slowly. I checked the map and realized that the cabin was about 5 kilometers ahead. The snow made progress more difficult, but I pressed on. After all, the plan was simple, and I was confident I would arrive before nightfall. It was then that I got lost. The snow grew heavier, covering the signs of the trail. The map no longer seemed to correspond to the terrain in front of me, and I began to feel panic set in. Visibility dropped quickly, and the icy wind cut across my face like blades. I shouted for help a few times, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the white vastness around me. There was no one there, just me and the sound of the wind. After hours of wandering without a clue, I stumbled upon something buried in the snow. It was an old, torn backpack, with part of its contents scattered around. Inside, I found a frozen water bottle, a wet diary, and a broken flashlight. The diary was partially legible. The pages spoke of someone named Evan, who was trying to find shelter before a snowstorm. The last entry read, "I saw lights in the distance. Maybe there's someone there. I hope it's not my imagination." Discomfort started to creep over me. But before I could think more about the diary, I noticed something in the distance. A faint light flickering among the trees. The light was my only hope. I walked toward it, stumbling and slipping in the snow. Each step felt heavier, and the cold began to affect my movements. When I finally found the source of the light, I realized it was a small cabin. It looked abandoned, with loose boards and snow piled up on the roof. The light came from a lantern placed on the porch, swaying in the wind. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I forced the doorknob, and the door creaked open. The interior was simple, with an old bed, a table, and a cold fireplace. There were signs that someone had been there recently, boot prints on the floor, and a dirty mug on the table. As I explored, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps, slow, coming from outside. I rushed to the window but saw no one, just darkness and falling snow. I thought it could be my mind playing tricks, but the footsteps continued, now circling the cabin. I decided to lock the door and wait. My flashlight was almost out of battery, so I crouched by the window to try to conserve energy. The silence was absolute, but my heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the wind. Suddenly, a sound made me jump. It was a scratching at the door, followed by a light knock. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response, just more scratching. I grabbed the knife I had found in the backpack and approached the door. When I gathered the courage to open it, there was no one there, just fresh marks in the snow leading to the side of the cabin. I illuminated the path with my flashlight and saw something I will never forget. A figure was standing about 10 meters away from me, tall, cloaked in something that looked like a very heavy man. I couldn't make out the face, but I felt it watching me. Before I could react, the figure took a step toward me. I ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The footsteps started again, now faster, as if they were running around the place. The cold fireplace in the corner began to emit a strange smell, like burnt flesh, and I noticed that the room was getting colder. My flashlight went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. Everything went silent for a moment, but then I heard one last knock on the door. This time it was not followed by footsteps or sounds, just a sound of something dragging for a long time. I waited until dawn to leave. There was no sign of the figure, but the marks in the snow around the cabin were real. I followed the footprints that led to a point where they simply disappeared. When I finally managed to get out of the woods and tell my story, no one believed me. But I still have the diary I found in that backpack, and sometimes I reread the last entry, wondering if Evan saw the same lights I did. Some things cannot be explained. Report 2. Last winter, I went on a trip that had all the makings of a great adventure. My two friends, Ryan and Max, and I planned a hike to a remote peak in a snow-covered mountain region. The idea was challenging, but we were prepared, or at least we believed we were. After a few hours of hiking, we were caught off guard by an unexpected snowstorm. With visibility nearly zero, we lost our way completely. Separated by the wind and snow, what was supposed to be an exhilarating experience quickly turned into a nightmare. We were on the second day of the hike when the weather suddenly changed. The clear sky was replaced by heavy clouds, and the snow began to fall heavily. We tried to keep our pace, but the storm intensified rapidly, making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. In the midst of the confusion, Max decided to take what turned out to be a shortcut. Ryan and I followed him, but within minutes, we realized he had gotten lost. The wind howled so loudly that we could barely hear our voices. After hours of wandering, we separated. Ryan was looking for a way back, while I stood still, trying to conserve energy. The snow around me seemed endless, and the cold pierced to my bones. It was then that I saw something in the distance, a dark, motionless shadow standing out against the white of the snow. My first thought was that it was Ryan or Max. I shouted for them, but the wind carried my voice away. I decided to approach, hoping it would be one of them. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person, but rather a structure. It was a small wooden cabin, partially covered by snow. It looked old, with broken windows and a door slightly ajar. With no other option, I entered. The interior was even darker than I expected. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of mold filled the air. There was an unlit fireplace in the corner, an old table with broken chairs, and a dirty mattress leaning against the wall. As I explored, something about the place felt off. The silence was absolute, but I sensed I was being watched. I began to search the place for something useful. I found a candle and matches, which I lit to better illuminate the space. It was then that I noticed marks on the floor, as if someone had dragged something heavy. I followed the marks to a door at the back of the cabin. It was locked with a rusty padlock. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that something had been intentionally kept away from prying eyes. While trying to understand what was happening, I heard a sound coming from outside. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like a faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. I froze for a moment, waiting to hear it again. And then it happened. Knocks on the front door, slow and firm. "Ryan, Max," I called, my voice echoing through the small space. There was no response. The knocks continued, louder now, as if someone was forcing their way in. Not knowing what to do, I blew out the candle and hid behind the table. The silence returned, but it was soon broken by the sound of the door creaking open with a long, agonizing groan. My heart raced as I tried to peek without making a sound. In the doorway, a figure entered. It was tall and thin, with tattered clothes and an odd posture. The dim light coming through the door did not reveal its face, but the way it moved seemed wrong. The figure stopped in the middle of the cabin, as if it were listening for me. The sound of its breathing was irregular and heavy, filling the small space. Without warning, it began scratching the floor with its nails, producing a high-pitched sound that made my stomach churn. Gathering my courage, I ran to the back door, completely forgetting about the padlock. I pulled with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was then that I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The figure was still in the room, now looking directly at me. Its eyes reflected the dim light, shining in a way that seemed unnatural. With no way out, I grabbed an old chair and threw it at the nearest window, shattering the glass. I jumped outside, falling into the snow and feeling the extreme cold hit me hard. I ran aimlessly, hearing heavy footsteps behind me. I didn't know if it was real or just my mind, but I kept running until I finally found a road. Eventually, I was rescued by a search team. I never saw Ryan or Max again. When I recounted what happened, no one believed me, claiming it was the effect of the cold and isolation. But I still have nightmares. In my dreams, I hear the knocks on the door and the sound of that heavy breathing, always chasing me. Some things should never be faced alone. Relato 3. A few years ago, I had an experience that still gives me chills. I worked as a sales representative and spent a lot of time on the road, traveling between small towns. On a rainy winter night, while driving home after a long week of work, something happened that changed my perspective on night travel. The road was deserted, surrounded by dense forests and mountains that cast giant shadows under the dark sky. The heavy rain made visibility difficult, and I drove carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on the headlights that illuminated only a few meters ahead. After hours of driving without seeing another car, I began to feel tired. I decided to turn on the radio to stay alert, but there was no signal, just static. The silence inside the car, broken only by the sound of the windshield wipers and the rain hitting the roof, heightened the feeling of isolation. As I rounded a tight curve, I saw something that made me slow down. On the side of the road, a man was standing in the rain, his hand extended in a hitchhiking gesture. He looked disheveled, wearing only a thin jacket and jeans. I thought about driving past, but something about him made me feel empathy. Maybe it was his worn expression or the fact that there were no towns nearby. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. "Yes, please." "My car broke down a little further up," he replied, pointing into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, but I decided to let him in. He settled into the passenger seat, repeatedly thanking me. I noticed that his hands were extremely cold. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to be friendly. "If you could drop me off at the next town, that would help a lot," he said, giving a weak smile. We continued on the road, and I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. He was reserved, responding with one-word answers. I noticed he avoided eye contact, staring fixedly at the road ahead. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "You know, it's not safe to pick up strangers on the road." I smiled, thinking it was a joke. "Maybe it's not safe for you to hitchhike with a stranger," I joked. He slowly turned his head in my direction, and for the first time our eyes met. His eyes had a strange glimmer, and his expression was serious. Sometimes, strangers are the most dangerous. A wave of discomfort washed over me. I tried to change the subject. "So, your car broke down? Do you want me to call a tow truck when we get to the town?" "That won't be necessary," he replied, looking back at the road. The rain seemed to intensify, and the winding road grabbed my attention. It was then that I noticed something that made me freeze. In the back seat, through the rearview mirror, I saw a reflection that shouldn't be there. It looked like a shadow, as if someone was sitting behind me. I glanced quickly over my shoulder, but there was no one there. It must have been a trick of the light caused by the headlights and the rain. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of unease grew. "Are you okay?" the man asked, still staring intently at the road. "Yes, I'm just a bit tired," I replied. He paused before saying, "Maybe you should rest. I can drive for a while." The suggestion alarmed me. "No thanks, I'm fine." He then let out a light sigh. "You know, it's funny how things happen. Sometimes we meet people we will never see again. Other times, those encounters change everything." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean by that?" Before he could respond, the car radio, which had been static before, started to crackle. A distorted voice emerged, saying words I couldn't understand. The man next to me began to laugh softly. "Are you listening?" he asked. "Listening to what?" My voice barely came out. "The music, it's my favorite." The radio fell silent again. The discomfort became unbearable. I decided that as soon as I saw a gas station or any lit place, I would stop the car. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. "It's a shame about the accident up ahead." "What accident?" I asked, curious and confused. "You'll see soon." As I turned the next corner, I saw flashing lights. Police cars and ambulances blocked the road. I pulled over and an officer approached. "Sir, the road is closed. There has been a serious accident," he said. "But What happened?" I asked, still shaken. "A man was hit while trying to get help. The driver lost control because of the rain." My heart raced. I looked to my side to tell my passenger, but the seat was empty. The door was locked and there was no sign that anyone had been there. The officer noticed my panic. "Are you okay?" he asked. There was a man with me just now. He needed help because his car broke down. He was sitting right here." The officer looked at me with concern. "Sir, you are the first car to pass through here in over an hour. Are you sure?" I searched for any sign, but the seat was dry with no marks. Confused and scared, I tried to explain, but it seemed useless. Since that night, I avoid driving on deserted roads. I don't know if I encountered something supernatural or if my mind played tricks on me due to exhaustion. But every time it rains, I remember that man and the enigmatic words he said. Some encounters stay with us forever.